Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? The day before Thanksgiving. 2020's been certainly a challenge, but we still have lots to be thankful for. In the grand scheme of things, life's pretty good on planet Earth in spite of itself compared to how most people through history have lived. And I also have to remind myself that there's people out there who still today have a much more difficult time of it than we do, or than I do. I know it's a cliche, but it's true. You know, we have water, we have heat, we have food. Hopefully, at the worst, we got to wipe our butts with our hands. By the sounds of it, the toilet paper thing's beyond me. I'm ready for 2020 to be a memory so we can laugh about it and remember the good things about it. Hopefully this election mess will settle down. But as I've said before, a lot of the economics that are bigger than the nation don't change as a result of an election anyway. There's a lot of functionality and form to global policy that doesn't change or alter under any administration. And even a madman can tinker with some of it, but he can only adjust so much of it. So much of it's so much grander than the scheme or want or power of any nation's president. And it's kind of insane to think otherwise. I was watching this interesting conspiracy theory documentary the other day, and it was hard to tell if it was far left-wing or far right-wing. And you realize in some points that it's a full circle, and that they kind of share a lot of the same underlying truths. They expose some things that are true on both the far left and the far right. They just point the fingers in different places as who's behind it. It was kind of interesting, a bit mind-numbing at times, and then of course eventually the doctrine got pretty ridiculous. But moving on. One of my favorite names in jazz is the name Dick Wetmore. It's a fun name. I enjoy saying it. It's an interesting little session here on Bethlehem. I believe it was the last or second to last 10-inch they did, 1035. So I think it's actually the third last 10-inch Bethlehem does, towards the very end of probably 55, the run of 10 inches that they do. He's a violin player. And in today's episodes, we're going to cover some of the more interesting instruments in jazz, the non-traditional instruments in jazz, and how a lot of them can be presented in such a way where they become very almost traditional sounding, where we don't even pause and go, this is weird. Jazz has a way of enveloping anything into its sound, and as long as you play it with some essence of the blues and some essence of swing, you can play anything in the world and bring a jazz sense to it. He's not the first guy to play violin in jazz. The most famous was probably Stefan Grappelli, and I didn't pull him in part because I feel Stefan Grappelli's stuff is very rooted in the European sound. It's very linked to Django Reinhardt and that whole Parisian Café de Paris, that sound. And it's just a different sound. It's got a bit of a gypsy, we're heading down to the Riviera on the weekend, darling. We'll be sailing off Corsica. It'll be marvelous. We do have some great vintages to sample from. The European lifestyle is so much better in so many ways than the North American experience. And North Americans don't get it or see it or realize it or care. But having a strong middle class and healthcare, it makes the differences between us less so. It makes the gulf between our existences less polarized. And there's still extremists, of course, anywhere. But there's times where I pine for the urban fabric of Europe with far more I'm not gonna say equal, because obviously there's poorer areas and really wealthy neighborhoods, but I've been watching a lot of Top Gear and Grand Tour lately, and it's just amazing how city after city after city, you don't see what you see when you see America. You know, Detroit and Paris don't look anything the same. Marseille, Birmingham, Glasgow, none of it looks like the American urban decay. But it's an interesting record. It really is. It's kind of an unknown band here. Dick Wetmore, Ray Santisi, Bill Nordstrom, Jimmy Zatano, and Bob Zeef. It's a fairly traditional sounding record aside from the violin. It doesn't really sound like the Grappelli Reinhardt stuff where it's very much got Cafe on the River Seine. This is much more of a traditional blues bass, kind of bass piano drums with the violin. So Dick Wetmore, an interesting piece. It's a pretty tough one to come by, and if you see it, you should grab it when you have the chance. It'll probably be $20, which isn't that much. The next thing I'm going to show you is a real bender of borders and genres. And what we're going to hear by Yusef Latif here, that's a Coke bottle. And I'm not sure how well you can hear that, but that is a Coke bottle being blown on the top in different registers. A little percussion. And then they're also going to play a balloon on this. There's probably him on the flute right there. It's Wilbur Harden plays a balloon and a flugelhorn. That's funny. Turkish finger cymbals played by Hugh Lawson. A bass and a rabat. There's a Chinese gong by Oliver Jackson. And an earth board. An argol. So lots of interesting instrumentation on this, which was kind of Yusef Latif's thing. I did a bio on him probably 6 months ago, and it was interesting. That's a balloon. And they are making the squeak of a balloon find the blues. And that's how endless and broad the ocean of jazz is. It's not fettered by instrumentation. And it's also, it doesn't have to be so out we can't listen to it for it to be interesting and avant-garde. And I think Yusef Latif does a great job of embracing the balloons just being rubbed and twisted. It's interesting. The song's called, I think, Joy and Happiness. Love and Humor, sorry. Same thing. He does a great job of just embracing world sounds and things that are avant-garde for their time, but still making them very much rooted in the tradition of the blues and black music. And he's a really creative mind out of Detroit. And I want to give a second sample of a little bit of the unique sounds that you can hear on a Yusef Latif record. And remember that Yusef Latif, he's doing some pretty interesting stuff in 57, 58, 59. So before that even, before Coltrane starts branching out, there's a great deal of interesting things happening in jazz and sound-wise. And this sounds here like a nest of bumblebees. Again with a Chinese gong. This sounds like it's not going to be good for your health. It's a pretty interesting cat, Yusef Latif is. This is Prayer to the East from probably 57 on Savoy. A very tough record to come by, as old Savoy's. kind of always are. Another guy who I'm a big fan of is Bob Dorough, and he actually makes a little bit of an appearance on a Miles Davis record, one of the second quintet records he shows up on. But he's one of the most interesting vocalese players in the genre. And he takes singing like a horn to a new level. He phrases, he reshapes syllables, and I think this is one of the most enjoyable records I own. I love it from stem to stern. I've played it at my gigs a lot because it's just so hipster, so beatnik, so... you put a beret on your head without you owning a beret. You were on a Vespa, and you suddenly became a whole lot more cultured. I speak 5 different languages when I listen to this record. Title after title on here, you just are hearing this very interesting, clever, cheeky, sassy version of song after song. I never dreamed it could be. Yeah. See how he kind of held the note a little off, like a horn player. He's just... It's fun record. Warren Fitzgerald, Jack Hitchcock, Bill Takas, and Jerry Siegel round out the record. Recorded in '56, early on the Bethlehem BCP series, and this is actually the first Bethlehem full-length album they make. It says B11, but the first 10, for those who forget, were 2 10-inches coupled on each side. So the first actual full-length session on Bethlehem to make a full-length LP is this Bob Dorough B11, and it's a tough record to find. It's not going to be under $100 anymore. It's actually a great cover as well. You see that cover and you just want to have that. But again, I used to play this a lot at my Saturday brunch gig. And you're waiting for your mimosa. You got some hash browns dripping down your chin, a little hot sauce over here. You got one eye still kind of closed from the sleep and the alcohol. And this comes on. It's like a bubbling soda of cool. It's just so cool. I can't express it. I love this record. I think it's really unique. Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross do some stuff in the same vein. King Pleasure does vocalese as well. There's a lot of people. Of course, Armstrong and Fitzgerald scat and do vocalese effortlessly. But the Bob Dorough take on it is very unique, and it's backed by a really, really strong blues groove. Next thing I want to show you is Dorothy Ashby, and she presents the harp to jazz. And we all know Coltrane's second wife, I believe, Alice, was a great harpist and art student. And I'm on record for saying I'm not the biggest Alice Coltrane fan. I think she has that last name now, and it just kind of gives her a leg up. And I don't know, maybe I'm just being childish about it, but I'm not as moved by her as a lot of people are. You know, I don't feel the blues coming from her necessarily. I feel more of an art student, being provocative and using the platform well, you know, but it's certainly speaking to white college kids and a very different crowd than Coltrane I feel like was speaking to. But by the end, Coltrane's on a whole different plane anyway. But she brings the harp to jazz, Dorothy Ashby, and in a much more traditional sense than Alice. Alice Coltrane could play fairly traditional, straightforward bop and blues as well, no question about it. And she was a fairly good pianist as well. But Dorothy Ashby has some stuff on the Prestige and New Jazz, She has some stuff on Atlantic, a record on Riverside, New Jazz, and a couple on Argo Cadet, which I think are both really solid pieces. I'm not sure who's on this. It's actually a white promo copy. Recorded in '61 at Termar Studios, Chicago. Dorothy Ashby. Herman Wright's on the piano, on the bass. I mean, John Tooley's on the drums. A bit of some water stains on the back. Some years of mileage on that sucker. But again, it is 50 years old. So no, 60 years old. When I say 1961, yeah, that's 60 years. Jesus. 20 years older than me. Let's hope I look that good in 20 years. But she's a really solid player. And again, it's one of those things that you're like, a harp doesn't work in jazz, does it? And it absolutely does. It absolutely does. And she's actually a very enjoyable listen. And her records on New Jazz Prestige are pretty solid, hard bop with some edges, even, with some edges. It's good stuff. Dorothy Ashby records aren't cheap. Jean Toot Steelman. He's also a great guitar player, but that's a harmonica. Again, not a sound we associate much with jazz, but in the hands of a true auteur, any instrument can play the blues. And we forget that the rural blues that jazz comes from, these cats were playing homemade string instruments, washboards, things that could rattle, beat, and pluck. Like, the blues played on anything it could find to make a little accompaniment. Jazz has urban city instruments because of its setting, but rural blues didn't have that. And it's amazing how Jean Toot Steelman, who I believe is a Belgian, I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure he's a Belgian. This is on Riverside, 257, I think about 1958. And boy, he plays with Pepper Adams, Kenny Drew, Wilbur Ware, and Art Taylor. So he's being backed by four of the baddest brothers in the studio. And he plays guitar on some tracks, but he actually plays a fantastic mouth harp. And I remember smiling ear to ear the first time I heard it. It's going, this works. It's something you bought because you're like, okay, I want to complete my, discography for Riverside 200 sequence. I better just get that in there. And the backing band's good, but it worked. It was so much fun. And sometimes you just gotta be shocked and allow yourself to be shocked. The next guy I want to show you is Matt Matthews. And Matt Matthews was a Dutch immigrant, as was my father. His name was he had a Dutch name. He changed it, modified it to sell it in the American marketplace. He plays the accordion. And again, we think polkas, we think not jazz, but he actually makes two great records here for the Dawn label. And again, it was something I was skeptical of, and then when I heard it, I just loved it. I was like, this is really, really, really good. And if you look at this Modern Art of Jazz by Matt Matthews album cover, you look at that lineup of musicians on that: Gigi Grice, Art Farmer, Dick Katz, Julius Watkins, Herbie Mann, Kenny Clark, Oscar Pettiford, Joe Puma. That's some pretty serious pedigree. So it gives a lot of room to a lot of different cats to show their light. But when you hear that accordion, it's just a real revelation. And he does a second record, The Art of Love, and he actually shows up as a sideman on quite a few Dawn sessions. I'm trying to find. There's some accordion right there. It's creating just kind of a backwards collage there. But fun stuff and kind of under the radar. And supported by a cast of really great talent, you know, and that's part of the wonder of jazz is you can be surrounded by such talent that it would just elevate. Like I could probably get on stage with a bunch of great jazz cats and play a wood block, and they could make my ass sound good. That's part of the deal. Another record Riverside does here, 348. So it puts it probably about 59, maybe early 60. And it's Harlem Banjo. And again, you say banjo. That's not going to work. And it's Elmer Snowden featuring Cliff Jackson. And it don't mean a thing, but it's got the swing. It's again, one of those things that you're like, this is not going to work, but it does. Tommy Bryant, Jimmy Crawford, Cliff Jackson, and Elmer Snowden, December 1960. And again, this is part of the brilliance of the black community in America. Harlem Banjo. And whatever falls into these brothers' hands, they're going to make it just be swingy, funky, sexy. You'll probably never hear a banjo sound sexier than it does in the hands of Elmer Snowden. It shouldn't be a thing. This shouldn't be happening. But it just shuffles along. It plucks and it dances and it's crazy. It's crazy that it works like it does. Now I'm going to show you a record here that is a really hard record to find by Pepper Adams, the great baritone sax player. And the baritone sax itself is a bit of an anomaly. Of course, Jerry Mulligan plays it, and a number of guys play it, but it was always kind of a peripheral horn, never at the center of the saxophone experience. And Pepper Adams is one of the finest baritone players, but we're not actually talking about the baritone here. We're talking about Bernard McKinney playing the euphonium. And the euphonium's like if I recall, something like a baritone, a small tuba that plays in the baritone range, which gives it an interesting right there. It gives it an interesting cross-reference to the tenor and baritone range of the baritone sax. You have that reedy baritone range, and now you have that brassy baritone range. And so the euphonium is an interesting thing to hear on this. And the guy actually changes his name not long after this to a Muslim name, which I thought I wouldn't forget, but I have forgotten. Hank Jones and Elvin Jones, brothers on the piano and drums, with George Duvivier on the bass. Again, a tough record to find, but it's certainly worth grabbing if and when you come across it. Now, another interesting horn on a really hard to find record, again on New Jazz. This is by the Modern Jazz Disciples. And some of this stuff is almost like a hard, driving, bluesy, pocket-living jazz. A bit like some of the Jazz Messenger stuff is doing, honestly. Probably not quite as hard-driven as that. Curtis Piegler is the name most people are going to know, alto and tenor. But William Kelly on this, Bill Kelly, plays what's called a normophone. And a normophone is something I looked up yesterday. I thought I could see here what the normophone was, but it doesn't list it exactly. If I recall what I read yesterday, it was something like a baritone trumpet, or it's got valves. It plays that smooth sound. And I'll try to look up a picture and post it before I post this video. But again, they're taking whatever any interesting tone they can find, and they can make it swing. And that's really the only essence of it. Does it swing? Another guy who we mentioned a little bit earlier, and he had a fairly long, fairly successful career, was Julius Watkins. And Julius Watkins is famous for playing the French horn in jazz. Not a horn you hear much of. He was a member of a group of Charlie Rouse for a number of years called the Jazz Modes, or the Lay Mode. And there's the French horn right there. It's smooth, syrupy, creamy. A sound unlike any other the French horn. It's languid. It's got a sorrow in it. And Watkins really plays the shit out of it. These are both on the Dawn label. And I found Dawn and Bethlehem both to be littered with records that were challenging convention. You know, these guys were always kind of looking for a doorway to success, because they didn't really have the big name artists on their roster, and so they were really willing to experiment with, as I showed you a month ago, all the bass players who got sessions at Bethlehem, all the different drummers who got to lead records. There's a lot of interesting instruments on Dawn records and Bethlehem records. They're just looking for a niche at all points. And I don't want to go back in there. Interesting stuff. And these records are both kind of climbing in cost. They'll probably cost 40 to 60 bucks nowadays. But the French horn is an instrument that you'll quickly fall into. And now I want to talk about the tuba and Ray Draper, of course. And more so than a lot of these instruments, the tuba has shown up in jazz throughout the years. It was never a commonplace instrument, but you certainly, I think a guy named Bill Barber plays tuba on Birth of the Cool. There's certainly tubists throughout the history of the music. I think Ellington dabbled in the tuba at times with his great groups. This is with Jackie McLean, Mal Waldron, introducing young Webster Young. And it's an interesting session. And he makes 2 records for New Jazz Prestige. And he has a very dexterous sound. That's, of course, Webster Young. There's the tuba. And it takes a fairly big lung capacity to blow through that big horn. And so to be able to play staccato notes and to find any kind of rhythmic lines takes a great deal of breathing. So it's pretty impressive. He shows up as a sideman on some other records around this time, and then he ends up going to jail for drugs for almost 10 years. And then he resurfaces and does a great record called Red Beans and Rice, which is proto-funk jazz ahead of his time. And he's a great player. And again, it shows you that jazz can really graft any sound timbre-wise into its housing. It's not about the sound your horn makes. It's about the foot you tap while you play that sound. And that's always an integral part of this equation. It's never about the horn or the instrument or the string. It's about the guy playing it. Does he have a story to tell? Is it compelling? And last, of course, in this little fun episode, we're going to take a look at Moondog. And he makes 3 records for Prestige in 58, 59. And they've all been reissued, which is those are. My wife got them for me for Christmas last year. And you want some weird stuff? Moondog was known as the Viking of 5th Avenue, or 6th Avenue, pardon me. He wore the big Vikings horns, sat on New York City strip of streets between, I think it was like 48th and 56th or something like that, on 6th Avenue or 5th Avenue. He was just there every day. And for decades he was there. And he would sometimes be playing, busking. Sometimes he'd just be out there talking, being eccentric with his horn. Sometimes he'd just stand there stoically as the city rushed by him. And he lived very much outside of that hustle and bustle. People didn't really know him as a musician even. They didn't recognize that he was a recording artist. They just thought he was the crazy Viking of New York. And he got really into the mythology of the Norse. And he invents instruments. He lives on the streets at times. Columbia pulls him back in the studio 10 years later and makes a record with him in 69. So there's quite a big gap there where he's just on the streets of New York. But he's kind of a loved figure. And that's kind of cool. It's one of the things about New York City that's so incredible is that there's so much of everything. Of black, of white, of gay, of straight, of urban, of rural. It just all conglomerates. Every language, every sexuality, it becomes all commonplace. So in spite of how weird you've become, New York's not going to look at you very long. It's not going to say, I've never seen something like that before, because it's seeing something like that almost every day. And so the weird, the abnormal becomes comfortable. And thus, it no longer is abnormal. It's just another part of the fabric of humanity. And Moondog definitely jumps into that niche. He, of all these artists, strays the most from a jazz-centered pulse. His rhythmic sensations are more of a teller of folklore, a myth, an epic. You know, it's got a kind of a rocking of a boat across great waters tale. It doesn't really have the swing of the blues to it very often, but he's in old Moondog records. If you can track him down, go for good money. But of course, these are just the reissues. So that wraps up my episode on some of the fun outside instruments in jazz, and there's a lot more examples of it. This is just the first dozen I thought of that I really either enjoyed or I thought needed to be mentioned in this episode. But they exist everywhere, you know, and a lot of interesting instruments are brought to the fore by guys who play something else normally, but we're going to dabble in this right now. Most of these cats I showed you, this is what they did. Dick Wetmore played the violin. You know, Dick Wetmore. It's just a fun thing to say. But anyway, I'm the Jazz Shepherd. Peace to you all. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Just pray you're all safe. I pray that we find a new unity. You know, and I'm talking beyond just the shores of my country or my continent or my race. Let's awaken to the broader reality of our blue planet in space and the vulnerable and need for functionality existence that we are a part of. As we go to Thanksgiving tomorrow, I know most of us are going to be in a smaller, diminished setting. Just stay home and not to drive, not to travel. You actually get to relax. Let's count our blessings. Let's count the things we're thankful for as we stuff ourselves with stuffing and clean the whipped cream off our noses and the pumpkin pie off our chin. Let's just recognize that there's so many things that we need to be thankful for today. And these jazz cats lived through such times that it inspired them to do this incredible music. And we should be thankful for jazz because it reminds us constantly of the good fortune that we have. Just like reading the Old Testament makes me thankful I wasn't traveling through the wilderness and slaughtering all those born in Canaan and living under the rule of the Philistines and the Persians and the Babylonians and the Romans, occupation after occupation. I live in a fairly peaceful interval in time. And crazy presidents aside, crazy pandemics aside, this doesn't seem like it's the Black Plague or the bubonic plague. There's not death tolls in the tens of millions, hundreds. We're going to come through this. They're probably going to give us all some vaccine that's going to allow them to microchip us or some shit. Who knows? I don't want to be all conspiratorial about it, but there's still some things about this that to me don't make sense or add up. I gotta say that. And maybe that's just because I live here in America where there's such conflicting dynamics to it. It would feel like if it was more of a genuine death threat that we'd have less time for politicking and pandering and just the divisiveness and the misinformation. But I think it's been a long time since we've had a real unifying threat. Terrorism wasn't that. And I suppose the Cold War was the last time we really had any type of unity nationally in that sense, where there was a bigger picture that we had to work together to focus on. And it's sad that we need to have an enemy and fear to find unity. And one of the dangerous things about fear is that we almost always end up sacrificing our own freedoms, our own liberties, our own ability to function freely because we've been taught that we will relinquish some of that freedom because it will help alleviate some of the fear. And me and my kids just watched the first 3 Star Wars episodes last weekend. The first 3, the clone part of the trilogy. And with all the stuff with the Senate and the rise of the Emperor and the way that they use war and fear and chaos to convince all the people who lived in the Republic to sacrifice freedom after freedom and to appoint the Chancellor as he ascended to the rank of becoming Emperor and the Empire was born. People will support that in fear. And that's the scariest thing about the present, is that fear should not be so prominent in our daily lives. And it takes a great deal of fomenting fear for it to be so omnipresent. And that's something I'm very sure of, is that the enemies aren't as real as they want us to believe. The dangers aren't ever present and at the gate. And the dangers we hear of in an election cycle are always escalated dramatically. I remember in 2016 there was this fear of this caravan of immigrants crossing Central America towards the American border coming to overrun the country. And they went on this for months about it. And when the election happened, it was just, we didn't hear about it. Black Lives Matter, these protests and riots, they happen in election years. And it's a way for them to polarize people and use fear. And let's just rise above it, guys. Let's be thankful for what we have that's good. Thankful for my family. Thankful for my stepkids. They drive me nuts sometimes, but I love them. We got 3 cats, a dog, 2 kids, and my wife. So the 8 of us are going to have Thanksgiving tomorrow. And I'm thankful for all you guys. I enjoy the dialogue, the feedback, the banter, the comedy, the opinions, the complaints. I enjoy all of it. It's fun having this chapter in my life and sharing it with you guys. And it's been interesting. And I think I've learned a lot and grown some in the process as well. But the bottom line is the music is the real teacher. I'm not teaching. That's not my job. I just try to share what the music makes me feel. And something I put on a Blue Note yesterday for the first time in a week. And it's amazing how instantly I feel the politics and racial dynamics of it. It's not like I'm making that up. It's when I play it. It's what I think about. It's what it becomes front and center in my mind. The civil movements. I don't sit there and fabricate it. I don't listen to Matt Matthews' accordion music and go, "Oh, civil rights was an incredible time." But I can't not listen to certain Blue Note records and have civil rights thrust into my frame of thinking. So it's so expressed in that aggression, in that exhaustion. So again, let's not allow ourselves to sink into a worse place than we are. Let's pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, try to carry each other's loads, and above all, let's try to all become a little bit more enlightened. Because the more intelligent we become, the more empathy we have for others. We recognize that their experience will often determine their behaviors. And a lot of times people are manipulated and pushed into places where they move out from. And a broader sense of understanding that money's behind most of it. Always is and always has been and always will be. When we understand money's behind all of it, it takes some of the actions of people and minimizes their compliance or their guilt. They were manipulated into that action. And so anyway, peace, love, happiness. Have a great Thanksgiving. Y'all be safe. Thank you to all of you for being part of my life. We'll talk to you all on the other side of the holiday. Peace.